The 24 teams that will take part in the Rugby World Cup in 2027 are now locked in. In this podcast, we'll be talking about all of them. Who is lucky to be there, who got unlucky not to be there, who we're excited in seeing, and to be honest, who we're a little bit worried about. I'm not having this conversation on my own. I am joined by returning guest to the HG Rugby podcast, Joe Santamaria. Joe, welcome back to the podcast. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me, Hugh.
Joe is the record holder for the most watched podcasts on HG Rugby ever on YouTube. 17,000 views for our chat, mostly about Los Pumas, but also about generally South American rugby. So, big standards to meet up to this week, Joe.
Yeah, I'm feeling the pressure, but we'll do our best.
Yeah, so let's crack straight on with it. So we're here to talk about the final qualification tournament initially. So we're going to talk about the final qualification tournament we just had to sew up the last of the spots, the 24th spot of the Rugby World Cup. Then we'll look at all the teams, who's there, what the pool stage might look like. And then we'll just talk about the state of Tier 2 rugby in general and what comes next for this kind of level of rugby. But Joe, I think the first thing we need to talk about is the road of how these teams who got to the final qualification tournament, repechage was much easier to say.
Yeah, it doesn't roll off the tongue, does it?
Yeah, got there. So the teams that we had were Samoa, Belgium, Namibia, and Brazil. And those are the teams that Samoa aside, I think mostly was expected. We'll get into the stories of each of them. But I think last time I spoke to you, Joe, we were pretty certain that it was Brazil who were going to be in this tournament. And it turned out that it was, but not without incident and not without going the long way around. So could you just explain to us what happened with Brazil and how they ended up being in this tournament?
Yeah, sure. So any listeners, if you want to pause at any point and just clarify, because there are quite a few moving parts here, but effectively what you had is the South American kind of regional qualification block, and the teams you can imagine, the Uruguays, Chiles of the world. And as many people will know, Chile went on to qualify by beating Samoa. I'm sure we'll come to that. But effectively what you had after those teams played against each other was a shootout between Brazil and Paraguay for the spot in the final qualification tournament. Brazil were regarded as the favourites going into that. They had some quite major and significant victories over Paraguay just 12 months before. And, for me as a kind of South American rugby nerd, it's very much my niche. This was a really fascinating kind of meeting of minds when it comes to rugby development in the region. As lots of people will know, anyone who's listened to the last episode I was on will know, both these teams rely heavily on their club sides in Super Rugby Americas. In the case of Brazil, that's the Cobras, and in case of Paraguay, it's Jacare. And they kind of took a few years ago opposing views about how best to grow the sport and how best to develop the national teams. Brazil very much focused on having as many Brazilian qualified players in that team as possible, whereas Paraguay, initially kind of out of necessity because they didn't have the necessary quality, populated their club side with a lot more foreigners, a lot of Argentinians, and gradually increased the numbers of Paraguayan players. And the view always was that maybe Paraguay's kind of strategy would pay off in time for the 2031 World Cup, but the 2027 might come too soon for them. As it turned out, actually, this year was a really fascinating one in terms of Super Rugby Americas, which ran February to June of this year. Cobras, the Brazilian franchise, finished bottom. They didn't win a game, albeit, as I mentioned, there were lots of Brazilian players getting minutes at what is a pretty competitive level. And anybody who watched some of the players go straight from the Super Rugby Americas final into the Pumas team to face the Lions and obviously win that game will know that competition is in a pretty healthy place at the moment. There's some really good players coming out of that competition. So Cobras lost every game, and whether or not that kind of affected some of the mentality in those close games for Brazil, we'll talk about maybe. Whereas Paraguay, the Jacare team, had quite a good season. They just missed out on the semi-finals, but they had some really big wins, including over the eventual champions Peñarol, the Uruguayan franchise. So anyway, going into this two-legged game, Brazil were definitely the favourites, but I was curious to see whether or not Paraguay would be able to compete and to what level they were. And they really did. It caught a lot of people out in the region. Paraguay won both legs, home and away, and looked to be heading off to the final qualification tournament. They would have been rank outsiders there, just like Brazil were, but it would have been a great experience for them. Alas, as anybody who followed Spain's travails over the past few World Cup cycles will know, oftentimes it's events off the pitch that dictate whether or not you make it. And Paraguay had to withdraw from that tournament, or decided to withdraw, because they realised they had fielded an ineligible player. Ramiro Amarilla, who was a fantastic player and brilliant for Jacare as well. It's a technicality. He was They thought he was qualified under residency based on the old rule. When it was 3 years, it was then extended to 5, and he seems to have been caught out on some kind of misunderstanding of Article 8 of the World Rugby Conventions. It's
So,
worth pointing out. Oh, gone.
sorry, I was just going to say, so we had Carl on to talk about Spanish rugby, and we kind of touched on this as well. And I think when people hear like, "Oh, you fielded an ineligible player," they think, "Oh, there's some kind of skullduggery that's gone on." But it sounds like it's actually quite easy to be caught out by these quite complex regulations.
I think that's definitely the case. And the other thing that's worth remembering here is that these unions are not well funded. We're not dealing with the RFU or kind of one of the major unions where there's huge teams worth of people. A lot of these people, are not making loads of money, and they don't have the manpower. Lots of people wearing lots of different hats in these unions. It's worth noting that Paraguay themselves were the people who realised that this player had been ineligible, and they got in contact with World Rugby. World Rugby didn't realise. So, you know, I don't get the sense there's any kind of skullduggery going on here. It seems like a really honest mistake. And actually, this player had played 5 or 6 games over the past 12 months, and nobody had raised any eyebrows. So it's a really unfortunate one for Paraguay because, those wins against Brazil, were the most famous in their history, the most significant in recent times. And, there's obviously 22 other guys in the squad for those games, and all of them had this dream of making the final qualification tournament, and who knows, the dream of maybe even causing some enormous upsets and making the World Cup taken away from them. But there's no sense at all that there was any kind of backhanded behaviour going on here. I think this is a genuine mistake, and it's a shame, but it's a shame for one team as an opportunity for another, and Brazil were gifted that opportunity, I gather, on very, very short notice. I've been speaking to people from the Brazil camp over the past couple of days, and obviously they were hugely disappointed to lose those games. The squad was beginning to dissipate. Their most capped player had retired, and suddenly they had to get the phone out and try and get the band together for a go at the final qualification tournament.
Yeah, that was the kind of. Was that what went wrong with Brazil then? Because, like you say, we all thought that they were going to beat Paraguay easily. And if you look up, most South American teams, their biggest ever wins in their history all come against Paraguay. But I remember seeing, I think it was Uruguay. Correct me if I'm wrong. It might have been Chile. Played against Paraguay, and the scoreline was a lot closer than we expected. And we thought, oh, that's unusual. But was it just players retiring? Personnel not being available that made the Paraguay shocked Brazil in this way?
It's a really good question. And you're right to say it was Uruguay who played Paraguay over 2 legs. And then the loser of that game went on to play the loser of the Chile-Brazil game, which is how Brazil and Paraguay came to face up against one another. Lots of people were surprised by how much of a fight Paraguay put up. I mean, the scoreline was fairly wide in the end, but there were sort of 20, 25-minute spells in which Uruguay weren't able to score, which was a surprise for many. I think ultimately professional rugby here and kind of high performance programs are so young, especially in a country like Paraguay, that an 18-month gap can be huge in the context of a team's development. Uruguay rested some players, that's worth pointing out as well. But the Super Rugby America side, Yacaré, they beat Peñarol this year, as I mentioned. Peñarol provides the vast majority of players for the Uruguay squad, certainly a very significant bulk of them. And not only did Yacaré beat Peñarol this year, but they did it with a record number of Paraguayans in their team. So I was curious to see how the two international teams would match up, because the gap is closing. I mean, these things take time, as we know, but a year in the context of rugby here is a long time, especially in a country like Paraguay, which doesn't have a particularly long-standing high-performance program. Players can make much bigger leaps forward, and squads can improve much faster than they can in places in the world where rugby has been established for a lot longer. So certainly that was a factor. Paraguay have improved, and I think it's really worth pointing that out. Often we leap kind of as journalists and commentators to who got something wrong. Paraguay are getting better, and that's something worth pointing out. In terms of the Brazilian side of things, there is a kind of murkiness off the pitch that is quite difficult to understand, but they released their head coach, or they parted ways with their head coach, I think 3 or 4 days, it was announced before the game against Paraguay. And clearly all is not well when that's happening. Emiliano Cafera, who was the head coach of the women's side, the men's side, he was head coach of Cobras as well. He left on very short notice. And again, I haven't been able to get to the bottom of exactly what's on there. I gather that story will come out eventually, but it's clearly something's going on. I believe there was a dispute about whether or not he should have gone, and it wasn't unanimous. So how much that affected their concentration, it's hard to say. And as you'll be familiar, covering other tier two nations, it's very difficult to get everybody together for any meaningful stretch of time. So the squad that played against Paraguay for those two legs was quite different to the squad that went to Dubai for the final qualification tournament, with more international players for the latter. So a combination of Paraguay improving, Brazil perhaps having off-field issues that distracted their preparation, and then the long-standing issue of player accessibility came into it. And I guess the final factor maybe is that, as we know so often in sports, winning is a habit. And the vast majority of that Brazilian side haven't had a win. I mean, you'll know this, having obviously followed Wales for a very long time. When you're in those tight games, and maybe we'll talk about this in the qualification tournament as well, when you're in those tight games that are 1-score, 2-score going into the last 20 minutes, having not won a game recently can really weigh heavily on you, because you do forget how to get over the line in those games. And I wonder whether Cobras, having lost all the games in Super Americas this year, kind of had a psychological hangover into the international window. But maybe I'm getting too psychological there.
Maybe. I think from a Wales fan point of view, I probably think there is a lot of that. I've always thought the same about Italy and Benetton. I've always thought if Benetton are going well, Italy will go well, and if they're not, then they won't. So that's Brazil. The other teams that were in it were Belgium, Samoa, and Namibia. We'll come to Samoa last, I think. But in the meantime, Belgium had a crazy route to the final qualification tournament. Let me find the cool graphic that I was looking at a second ago. So Belgium's route was that they finished 6th overall in Rugby Europe with 1 win in the pool stage. They then won the kind of seeding playoffs they have, a bit like the under-20s championship. And then they shocked Netherlands in the 5th place playoff. Everyone thought that Netherlands were going to win that. Netherlands coached by Lynn Jones, formerly Ospreys and Dragons coach, has coached, I think, Russia as well, maybe Germany. I don't know, I might be getting that wrong. So that was a big surprise. So Belgium were the first team to get locked in to this. And from what I understand is that there was a big kind of change in the kind of the level of player that was expressing interest to play for them. But previously it was a lot of kind of Belgian domestic amateur players. And then there were more players, as you would expect, coming from France to say, hey, I'll play for you. And I think their fly half that they had in the FQT was from Toulouse, is in Toulouse's academy. So that's interesting. So they came out of nowhere. And Brazil have actually, even after the FQT finished, Belgium have only lost one of their last 9 test matches, which was against USA. They beat Canada, and then they won these other games as well in Rugby Europe and FQT. So that was interesting. Namibia is probably the least interesting story. They finished runner-up to Zimbabwe. If you want to check out more about the Zimbabwean story, I've done 2 videos on Zimbabwe on this channel. Just search HG Rugby Zimbabwe. You can find either a joint interview with the head coach and the captain, or you can find a short documentary about how Zimbabwe, where they've come from, their rugby heritage and things. So I really recommend checking that out. So Namibia finished runner-up to them in Rugby Africa, and then won a playoff with the UAE to get into the FQT. UAE were runners-up in Rugby Asia to Hong Kong, and Namibia battered them. They won by 60 points or something, so they got into that from that. Then there's how Samoa ended up in this. Now I can come back to you on this one, Joe, because Samoa ended up in this tournament because of Chile. And were you there in the national stadium when this game happened?
I couldn't. The game was actually not in the national stadium. It was outside. It was in Valparaiso. I wish I could have got over there. I had another commitment, which meant I couldn't. I'm based in Buenos Aires, as you know. I couldn't get over there, and I haven't had FOMO like that for a very, very long time. Because if anyone didn't see this, this was for me one of the most enjoyable games of rugby I've seen in a very, very long time. Obviously, it was great for the region, but Chile had 2-legged playoff against Samoa because Samoa came last in the Pacific Nations Cup. Lots of people were assuming that would be a Canada or a USA, but ultimately it was Samoa who ended up in the playoff with Chile. Chile went to the US and played the first leg in front of virtually no fans because Samoa played their home game in the US. Chile really should have won that game. They were ahead and they ended up drawing, I think 32-all. It was a bit of a thriller, but it felt like a bit of a missed opportunity because one imagines that Samoa maybe would be able to go through the gears. Obviously, they're an established World Cup team. But that return leg in Valparaiso, they sold 20,000 tickets. There was a big kind of push to get extra tickets released for that game because they capped it initially at 12,000 or 11,000 possibly. And then once they increased the capacity, I think they sold the remaining 9,000 tickets in less than 24 hours. There was huge demand for that game. And you can commute there from Santiago, the capital. So, it's not quite the idea that rugby all over the country is growing, but certainly, you have to be a fan to get in the car and drive a couple of hours to get there. And to sell 20,000 tickets like they did was unbelievable. And then the game and the result, the performance to match, first ever win over Samoa to qualify for their second ever World Cup. I mean, it was an incredible day, I must say. But as I'm sure maybe we'll touch on when you talked at the beginning of the show about people who are lucky, people who are unlucky, people who deserve and don't deserve, and as much as that means anything in sport, the odds were always stacked in favor of the Pacific Nations Cup teams because effectively you could keep losing and keep getting opportunities to qualify in ways that no other region could do. So Samoa, of course, lost their two pool games in Pacific Nations Cup, lost against the USA, lost over two legs against Chile, and still end up in the same position as Namibia, Belgium, and Brazil. So, I think it was always likely that Samoa would come out of the Pacific Nations Cup, out of the final qualification tournament. But if anyone hasn't gone back and seen some of the footage from that Chile Samoa game in Valparaiso, I really do implore you to do so because it was a hell of an occasion.
I've just been trying to find it. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any. But the the way that Chile play rugby is so fun. It's got such a South American flavor, and they're so fast. They start really fast in games, and I think they tend to like drop off a little bit towards the end. Maybe they just run out of steam, but they were just better than Samoa. That was
Hmm.
just the long and the short of it. They were better,
They
probably
really
in
were.
both games.
And actually, as you say, stylistically, they're a really good team to watch. And I think, am I right in saying the Try of the Year award, the nominees have just been put forwards, and there's a Chile try from that game, Santiago
Oh, I'll try and
Pedrero,
find it.
the second row, who kind of finished off, a move in which six or seven players were involved in offloading. And actually, two of the four nominees this year are South American teams because one of the tries Argentina scored against the Lions is another one of the nominees. So it's a great spectacle. I mean, those Chilean fans, they're very loyal when they went out to watch their team, but they weren't short of entertainment either.
Yeah, I'm just trying to find this. Try. Oh, okay, I've got it. Right. So this is the try that Chile scored against Samoa in this game. So as you can see, it's multi-phase. I'm not going to commentate over it. People who are watching on YouTube can just chat about it. But like you say, like the footwork, the speed, the passing. I watched Chile versus I think it was Romania as well in the summer, and I was just blown away by their skill set.
No, and again, I think it's that point I made earlier about a year or 2 years of a high performance program here means an awful lot more than somebody who's perhaps graduating out of an academy in the Premiership or in the URC might do because they might have been exposed to high level coaching already. Whereas some of these guys, the level at which the improvement is happening is so much faster. And again, it's also worth giving a lot of praise to Pablo Lemoyne, the Chile head coach, who has been unbelievably transformative in the year since he took over. I think he took over in 2016 or 15. Someone will correct me in the comments, I'm sure. And at the time, Chile were kind of on par with Brazil. And obviously, we fast forward, whatever it is, 8 years, 10 years almost. And Chile are now qualified for their second ever World Cup. They've broken into the top 20 in the world. In fact, I think they're 17th. Speaking today, that might well change by the time this goes out. And he deserves a huge amount of credit for kind of transforming them on the pitch, but also he's been so involved in terms of developing pathways, working with schools, working with coaches. And it would be remiss not to give him a huge amount of credit for that.
Absolutely, completely agree. So that was what locked in who played in this final qualification tournament: Samoa, Brazil, Belgium, and Namibia. I think just before we talk about the performances of the teams, what did you make of it as a product, as an event that was put on? It was very compressed. I think it was Saturday, Thursday, Tuesday. The games were all played on. It was a round robin. Everyone played each other once, but held in Dubai, which seems to be somewhere which is looking to host more rugby, obviously, but then played in very high, difficult temperatures. What did you make of it as just an event?
Well, I mean, obviously, you're right. It being held in Dubai, I guess the generous viewing of that is it's a truly global tournament. You're bringing people from all over the world, and Dubai is obviously a travel hub. So perhaps access and flights make it an attractive destination. It's also worth pointing out, as you say, that Dubai, I think, is looking to get into this space. I don't know whether there are any kind of incentives offered to World Rugby, whether it was made worth their while to have it in Dubai. I don't know. But listen, playing 3 test matches in whatever it is, 9 days, doesn't sit brilliantly with me from a competitive standpoint, because obviously it favours the teams with greater depth. And it doesn't sit particularly well with me from a player welfare point of view. In terms of the rugby that we saw, I mean, there were some cracking games. I mean, the quality, in particular from, the Belgians, who I think, probably come out of this podcast as the true heroes. I think they were
For sure.
unbelievable. Was brilliant. I mean, Samoa, probably underperformed, but arguably have been underperforming now since the 2023 World Cup. So I don't know at what point that just becomes par for the course for them. But it was great that it was broadcast on Rugby Pass. So it was also on Disney Plus here, which is where all the other rugby is broadcast. So hopefully, I don't know the viewing numbers, but hopefully it got a lot of eyeballs. I know certainly in our kind of echo chamber on X, there was a lot of people really enjoying it, particularly enjoying the Belgians. I don't love the 3 games in 9 days.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough, and I think you're right, especially with Samoa, with some of their earlier games which they won quite easily. I think they very much took their foot off the gas
Hmm.
post 50 minutes and were like, okay, guys, this is a job done. We've got another big game in 4 days. Let's just chill out. So I agree with you there. So you obviously watched the Brazilian games, being a journalist who covers South American rugby. I think the game of the tournament before, like, I almost want to call it a final. It wasn't a final. It just happened to be the last game. But Belgium versus Brazil, um, blimey, that was an exciting one. So it was. I'm trying to remind me how it went. So Belgium went up, and then Brazil got back into it, and
Brazil
then
got back into it, and then there was a kind of distinct period where Belgium felt like they were on top, then Brazil felt they were on top. But going into that last 20, it was it felt like a case of next score wins almost. It was changing hands. Neither team seemed to be able to look after the ball. And obviously, for anyone who didn't watch it, the scoreline ended 30-27 to Belgium. It was an unbelievable game, and that was one of those moments. I was watching that game, and obviously having watched a lot of Cobras this year, and 19 of the squad of 30 for Brazil play their rugby at Cobras, and I was watching them, and I just thought, I they don't look like a team that I don't want to say believes they're going to win, because I don't think it's a question of belief. I'm not wishing to call that into question, but that they don't look like they're used to seeing out tight games. They don't, and I think that is a habit, especially in those final 15 minutes when fatigue sets in. Decision making, clarity around exit strategy. They didn't look like a team that was going to go on to win that game, and I think Belgium obviously got over the line. Had the game gone on an extra 3 or 4 minutes, there's every chance that Brazil could have snatched that win. And much as I have a soft spot for all the South American teams, I was kind of glad Belgium got that win, because it meant that we got that shootout in the final game, as you said, that kind of winner takes all match against Samoa. But from the Brazilian point of view, I think they lost all 3 games. They lost fairly heavily to Samoa, 48-10, which again, for where Brazil are, that's actually not a terrible scoreline. They were fairly robust in that game. They've always had a powerful set piece, a good scrum. They're missing a couple of key players as well. Their normal captain, Kleber Diaz, is out injured. Their hooker, Andy Pinheiro, who's a real sort of talisman for them, he was out as well. It's worth pointing out that it was the first time they'd ever played Samoa. It was the first time they'd ever played Namibia. And that group of Brazilian players, I think they've got an average age of 27. A lot of those guys will be around for another cycle. And they'll be better for that experience. But ultimately, they were always the weakest going into this final qualification tournament, as we mentioned. They kind of weren't meant to be there. And I think from a rugby point of view, they'll be relatively happy with the way they performed, albeit they would have loved to have got over the line in that game against the Belgians.
definitely, I completely agree with everything you said there. So if we now turn our attention to talk about the team that got out of it, that have now qualified for the Rugby World Cup, which is Samoa. And I think a lot of rugby kind of neutrals, long-term rugby fans will be relieved to see Samoa survive, and I do use the word survive very deliberately, and get the job done to qualify for the Rugby World Cup. What did you make of their performances? You obviously watched them against Brazil, you watched them against Belgium. When you look at the player quality that they have, the kind of talent disparity between themselves and the rest, I think I'm not being unfair to say, was quite stark in that they had Super Rugby and top 14 and sometimes Premiership players on the bench Someone like Abraham Papali'i to bring onto the field, who's amazing for cast week in week out and made a big difference when he came on in every game. They should really, there should be no competition between them and the likes of Belgium and Brazil and maybe, to be honest. And for Belgium to draw 13-all with them, it still, to me, in my opinion, speaks to an underlying problem there with Samoa. Because, to be frank, they shouldn't be finishing bottom of the Pacific Nations Cup in the first place, let alone failing to beat Belgium in a World Cup playoff.
No, I couldn't agree more. I think, you know, I agree. You're right to say that, a lot of kind of people who tune in for the World Cup, those kind of, I don't want to call them casual fans, but fans who don't follow the sport religiously, probably really enjoy seeing not only Samoa but the other South Sea Island teams at the World Cups because they're always great value, and they were brilliant in that 2023 World Cup. They had some really good performances. I must say, in terms of kind of the global growth of the game, I almost think it wouldn't have been a terrible wake-up call had Samoa not made this World Cup, because clearly something is wrong. It's hard to point out what that is. And so often, like I said, similar to Brazil, there are things going on off the pitch, but player for player, they should have won every game by more than they did. Of course, they didn't even win that final game against Belgium, as you said. Player for player, there's every argument to be made they should have beaten Chile as well, albeit it was a slightly different squad. So again, the same issues we're talking about with so many tier two nations: player access, the fatigue, the workload put on some of those players, the travel incurred by some of those South Sea Island players, a lot of whom are based in Europe, who have to kind of play a Southern Hemisphere international calendar with a Northern Hemisphere club calendar, similar thing to the Argentinians. There is something wrong, I think, with the way they performed in those games. I don't know what it is, but in 4 years' time, unless something changes, they'll miss out. Teams will beat them because Brazil and Paraguay, because they have the tie-in with Super Rugby Americas, they're going to continue to get better. Maybe we'll talk about whether or not Belgium are the big losers of this new global calendar, because what opportunities they're going to have to test themselves over the next few years, I don't know. But if it's not Belgium, it will be somebody else. Another team will emerge, and ultimately the South Sea Island teams, particularly Samoa this cycle, are relying on talent. And what we see so often in sport, especially a sport like ours, is that systems beat talent, and well-drilled teams beat talent, and teams that have a better structure will beat a team full of talented individuals. I think that's kind of where I'm at on it. And maybe, to give more credit to the Samoans, I think that those Samoan teams, those great Samoan teams of the past, have always done better in World Cups. They've always played above themselves, probably because of that prolonged time together going into camp, but also because the necessary emotion, I think, to carry them over the line. One gets the sense that, I'm not suggesting at all they were complacent in these games, but it's hard to get yourself emotionally up for these games in the same way as when you're playing a top team if you know that you're meant to win. And I wonder whether that was a factor, whether they struggled to get out of second gear.
I agree. And, to be kind of hyperbolic and overharsh, and I am trying to put together a special podcast purely on Samoan rugby, because we've mentioned it when we did the Pacific Nations Cup review with Stephen Noble and things. He said he used exactly the same words as you. Like, there's something wrong here. And we get in the comments every time we talk about Samoa, people explaining, the governance and the corruption or the financial issues or whatever it is. But I want to do a special pod on it. But if I'm to be hyperbolic and maybe a bit mean, I felt like in that game against Belgium were going, this is our chance to turn Belgium into a rugby nation and to have a future and to open a door for us. And we're playing for everything. You could see how disappointed they were on the pitch at the end of the match. Whereas Samoa, I think, were just kind of, they were there because they had to be, kind of thing. And maybe that's a bit harsh, but like you said, like everybody said, there's something wrong with Samoa. And I can't. One thing that I disagree with you a little bit on is you said it might have been a wake up call. I actually think if they hadn't have got through, it would have been a knockout blow. That's if Samoa hadn't have qualified for the Rugby World Cup, they might never be seen again. To be honest, because
Really,
I think the problems are that big, and I think that. I just think that they're falling out a lot. When I look at those players, I don't see a group of players who are loving what they're doing, and there are that many problems. So it's a big topic that I really want to get into more, and I hope that I can put together a special Samoan podcast to talk about it. But they're in, and them being in, and like you said, um, they do better at World Cups. They've now become a bit of a wild card because they're in the bottom seed. They've just slipped into the bottom seeding group, but you would expect that when the World Cup comes around, they're going to attract a lot of players around the world who qualify for Samoa who till now haven't put their hand up and said, I'll turn out for you, will now say, yeah, I'll play for you at Rugby World Cup. I fancy that. And so now they're kind of a bit of a, if there is going to be a group of death at this next Rugby World Cup, it will be the one that has Samoa in it. So let's look at the.
Yeah, I mean,
Go
it's not
ahead.
inconceivable. We could have a pool with South Africa, Australia, Japan, and Samoa. I mean, which would be an absolutely savage group of four.
Yeah.
And as you said, I think we're going to get on to the
Yeah.
new
So I've made this
format.
incredibly high tech graphic here for everyone
Look
to
at
look
this.
at with all the teams. Now, this isn't locked in. So this weekend coming up, when we're recording this, is the Thursday before Georgia and Japan play, and that's a massive game. Whoever wins that it goes from being a third seed to a second seed. So at the moment it's Georgia. It could easily be Japan. I actually think that Japan will win that game, but we'll wait and see. Um, so these are the pools as they are. So you got the first seeds. So I'll tell you, Joe, I'm going to ask you kind of what springs out to you about this, but whilst you have a think about it, I'm going to read it out. So I'm going to give you a bit of time to think. So uh, South Africa, New Zealand, England, Ireland, France, Argentina are the top seeds. I'm going to ask you about Argentina later in the show as well. Um, Seeds two is Australia, Fiji, Scotland, Italy, Georgia, Wales. Seed three will be Japan, USA, Spain, Uruguay, Tonga, Chile. And then seed four is Samoa, Zimbabwe, Canada, Romania, Portugal, and Hong Kong, China. And it is six pools of four. So it's no longer full pools of five, obviously, because we've gone to 24 Team World Cup. It is now six pools of four. They've added a round of 16. The top two from every pool goes through, plus, I guess, the four best third place teams. So a lot of teams go through. So I guess what first question, Joe, is what stands out to you from the potential selections there, the pools there? What is the first thing that pops into your mind?
Well, obviously, with my kind of South American hat on, delighted to see that both Chile and Uruguay, not confirmed yet. Uruguay have a game this weekend against Romania, but barring a defeat by more than 15 points, I believe they're going to be in pot three. Delighted for them because I think the teams in that third pot really are the ones who are the big winners of this new format because, as you mentioned, four best third place runners up. So suddenly you have a situation where if you are a Chile or a Uruguay, you will, in theory, Samoa being the outlier to this, you will, in theory, have a game that you should win in your pool, meaning that as long as you can, try and get a bonus point in that game or you can try and get a losing bonus point in other games, there's a chance that you could be playing knockout rugby. And, for a team like Chile, who have only competed in one World Cup and, lost by very large scorelines, I think England put 70 odd points on them, possibly more. I think Henry Arundel scored 5 in that game. Suddenly that team at the following World Cup will be thinking to themselves, hang on, we could actually get into a knockout stage here. And, maybe I think we're going to get onto this later on about, the new format and some of the drawbacks to it. But for me, especially kind of, maybe it's sacrilegious in this podcast, I don't know, but I do enjoy the Football World Cup as well. And I'm a
It's
fan of
allowed.
the last 16. Oh, I'm
We
delighted to
acknowledge
hear
it
it.
exists.
I'm a fan of the last 16 format. I'm a fan of more teams getting access to knockout sport because in knockout sport, things happen that don't normally happen in round robin formats.
Yes, I think so. I think one of the things that I didn't realize, but someone pointed out on social media yesterday, is that you can have an all Pacifica pool. You can have New Zealand, Fiji, Tonga, and Samoa all in the same one, or you can swap Fiji and Australia there as well. That would be cool. From a Wales point of view, we can't be in a pool with Australia, which is a nice change.
Which is a relief.
And we might not be able to be in a pool with Georgia either. But I think we're gonna. I've got a terrible feeling that Wales are going to be playing Japan at least once every season from
Mm.
now till eternity, and just based on what happened last weekend, that might not always go well for us. It's cool to see Tonga be third seeds. I think that's great recognition for the progress they've made in the last 12 months.
Hmm.
And like you said, the I completely agree with what you said about the third seeds are the real winners because USA, Spain, who obviously missed out on the last Rugby World Cups as we spoke about, are probably going to win a game against the fourth seeds because there is, and this kind of brings us around to talking about maybe some of the drawbacks, is there is quite a big drop off. The further that you go down, that between the top 12 plus Georgia, there is a big step between them and the rest. And I don't think anyone ranked below 13th in the world would beat anyone above them. That's my opinion. I actually think that they would lose quite heavily against most of them. Like the evidence I've got for that is like the Pacific Nations Cup, where Japan and Fiji absolutely destroy everybody, or Rugby Europe, where Georgia destroy everybody in that. So, Joe, we've just come off the back of the Women's Rugby World Cup, where during the pool stage of that, the main complaints that everybody had was during the pool stages, there were no competitive games. I think probably Australia, USA, and then I think there's another one that I'm missing, South Africa, Italy, were the competitive games in the pool stage, and every other match was a blowout. And to be honest, we are looking at something very similar in the Men's Rugby World Cup at 2027 of there might not be a competitive match until the quarterfinals. And that's with a round of 16 put in. So that's a mean way of phrasing it. What's kind of your response to that?
I mean, it's a risk, isn't it? There's no denying it's a risk. I'm of the view that it's not something insurmountable. I think the Women's World Cup, as you mentioned, will be remembered as a brilliant step forward for women's rugby. I don't think it'll be remembered for big victories or defeats in pool stages. I think that the notion that there won't be competitive matches in the pool stage, I think, is perhaps slightly overstated, because I think, obviously, as Wales will be in pot two. One imagines that Wales will have improved by the time the World Cup comes around. They might be able to put it on a competitive game against whoever is the top ranked team in their pool. Likewise, if you look at the most recent World Cup, obviously the best teams in the pool will rest players, and sometimes that means the game's a little bit more competitive. Uruguay had a very competitive match with France at the last World Cup, and obviously France went into that, as one of the favourites. The likes of Portugal obviously had that great win over Fiji, didn't they? They beat Fiji.
Yes, they did.
And so, there won't be loads. There's not going to be. I don't think we're about to see Hong Kong, China beating the All Blacks. Let's not overstate these things. But
I don't think that's going to happen either.
that's a hot take on the podcast. But I'm of the view that there will be upsets. I think there will be more wins for the tier two nations than we are expecting. And ultimately, as fans of rugby rather than just fans of our respective countries, I think we need there to be, because the new format, the new global calendar that's being kind of hashed out before our eyes is not set up, I think, to shake up the established order in the way that I would like it to be. And I say that as a fan of Ireland. I say that as a kind of I guess adoptive fan of Argentina, who are obviously high level sides already, but it's important to be fans of the sport, not just fans of your team. And I would like to see a world in which it is easier for perhaps a Georgia to supplant Wales, and we'll talk about who's been put into the new Nations Championships and Nations Cups later. So I think what the sport needs the tier two teams to get a couple of upsets, or at least games that warrant further exposure. I'm quietly confident, we'll talk again maybe nearer the time, but I'm quietly confident that there'll be more upsets than we're imagining at this stage, or certainly more games that go into the final 15, 20 minutes as competitive outings.
Okay, I see. I think you've made some good points there. I'm still a little bit more on the nervous side. I'm maybe the bad cop in this situation, because for example, whoever New Zealand gets at the moment, I'm seeing them maybe having. It depends who they get, because you could have a pool, for instance, of New Zealand, Georgia, Spain, and Hong Kong, for example. And in my opinion, based on the data that we have now, there will be no competitive games in that pool. And I think that will annoy a lot of people, and especially if you have, like we said, those third seed teams getting into the round of 16, where you could have pick a random one, Spain playing the Springboks in a World Cup knockout game, and that could be either the Springboks will put out a rotated team in a World Cup knockout game, or it will be a horrendous scoreline. So I'm not saying I want that to happen, but I'm saying that that's probably the likelihood of what will happen. And I think that the reaction that will get, and we know that at Rugby World Cups, and we know that these big events in rugby are what draw far more eyes than normally do. So the impression that people might get of rugby from tuning into that, like, oh, okay, because this is what we spoke about a little bit before we started recording, was in football where you have the likes of North Macedonia playing against England, for example, that could be 2 or 3-0, and it doesn't look so bad because football is a low scoring game. Whereas in rugby, if one team's a lot better than the other, the good team will score a lot more points. And I'm just nervous about the kind of how rugby is going to look like, and I'm also nervous about how people in these nations who don't normally watch rugby, a like USA, for example, a USA fan tunes in to go, oh my goodness, the USA are in a knockout game of the Rugby World Cup, and then they watch their team take a horrible scoreline. They might go, oh, well, I'm not watching this again. This is rubbish. That's what I'm scared of.
No, I think look, I think that concern is pretty well founded. I suppose the counterpoint is, when do you expand the World Cup? Do you have to wait until every single one of the 24 teams could in theory beat the other? Well, I don't think that's ever going to happen. I don't think in any sport you have to go into a World Cup where there's any more than 5 teams that can conceivably win the tournament, barring some kind of crazy upset. So I think that it is a risk, but I think, to take your point, if you were a fan of those kind of teams from, let's say, 12 to 20, historically, you would have been among the worst in the World Cup and you would have been getting beaten in virtually every game. If you were a fan of Portugal or Uruguay or the USA or Canada or Chile, you're used to watching your team lose at a World Cup. Whereas those same fans are now watching their team, and they might be watching their team get a victory in the World Cup. So you're kind of shifting the I suppose, the misery onto a slightly lower ranked team whose fans are going to have to watch their team lose. But the counterpoint to that is you'll be seeing teams who aren't normally at a World Cup. So if you're a Zimbabwe fan, you haven't been in the World Cup since, is it 95?
91.
91, crikey. So a whole generation of people who've never seen their team at a World Cup. And I think it can't go on in perpetuity, but I think if I was a Zimbabwean fan and you offered me the chance to go and see my team lose in 3 World Cup matches, I would take it over not seeing them there at all. Whereas if you're a Uruguayan fan, this is their 4th World Cup in a row they've qualified for now. You'd now be thinking, okay, I'm ready to see my team take the next step and get a couple of wins, and or get a win certainly. And I think the expanded format, affords them that possibility. So you're absolutely right that the top teams will cruise to the quarterfinal stage. But, if you look at the last World Cup, quite a lot of those top teams, didn't have to really do a huge amount. Obviously, the seeding was unfortunate because it meant that South Africa and Ireland were in the same pool as were France and New Zealand. But, I understand your concern. I do share it to an extent. And you're right, maybe in the situation I'm playing good cop. But I'm trying to imagine how I would feel were I a fan of Zimbabwe or Hong Kong, China, or Belgium had they made it. And I think that when we're talking about a global calendar and the expansion of the World Cup, we have to try and kind of make decisions with those nations in mind as well. And I think this is what I would want. There are lots of other things about World Rugby's calendar that I would not want if I was a Belgian fan, for example. But I'm quietly optimistic that there will be enough competition, particularly in between those kind of middling teams, that there'll be some really good spectacles in there. And ultimately, it's my view that, there's never been a Rugby World Cup in which there weren't big losses. And I don't think those are the things that stand the test of time. I think the things we remember are the games that come later in the tournament or the upsets.
Yeah, I think you're right. So let's kind of to that point about what you mentioned about getting these teams, these lower down teams, better to a point where they might be more competitive. I actually think, and this is kind of controversial to say in rugby, is that I actually think that World Rugby have made a good step in order to achieve that, which is with the new Nations Championship. Now, we all know about the Tier 1 version, and we will talk about that right towards the end, but let's talk about the Tier 2 version of it now. I actually think this is really cool. So let's talk about this now. So this is those teams ranked from 13th down to 24th. So the teams that have qualified for the Rugby World Cup, when World Rugby released this graphic, they didn't know whether it was going to be Samoa or Belgium. So we know that it's Samoa in this pool. I think as I explained the format, you'll see that I think everyone assumed it was going to be Samoa. So you've got Pool A of Georgia, Hong Kong, Portugal, Romania, Spain, and Zimbabwe in the Europe, Asia, and Africa pool. Perfectly logical formatting, against the Americas and Oceania pool between Canada, Chile, Tonga, USA, Uruguay, and Samoa. And the idea is that everyone plays the opposite pool, so the other pool. So you don't play against teams that you would normally play against. It would have been a bit awkward if Belgium had beaten Samoa, and then Belgium would have been in the Americas and Oceania pool and had to play against Georgia and Romania, who they play every year anyway. But fortunately, I guess that hasn't happened. So this is, I think, is going to be really good for teams looking to take that next step. So for the likes of Zimbabwe, for the likes of Chile, for the likes of maybe Hong Kong to a lesser extent, of playing against teams more their level, getting exposure to different styles of rugby, and standing a chance of winning games. Like, I don't think that Zimbabwe playing against the Springboks, whilst I'm sure it would get a massive crowd, is going to do much for either of those teams. Whereas Zimbabwe versus Canada, I think that's really a game worth playing. So I'm really excited by this. I'm actually more excited by this than the tier one version. Kind of, what's your take on it?
No, I totally agree. I think that, the matchups that suddenly become possible and are going to become a lot more common, I mean, I've been waiting for a Chile-Spain game for ages, and I think that's a really competitive game. I love the two Spanish-speaking countries going up against each other. I think it's great for the growth of the sport, the sharing of ideas, all those things. I think and again, one doesn't want to become one of those rugby voices that focuses on the negatives, because I think ultimately this is great for the nations we've described. I can't help but think that if I was a Belgian rugby fan, I would think and this format was decided ahead of the game they lost against Samoa, and if they'd won that game, they would have been in there. But if I'm a Belgian rugby fan today, I'm thinking my country's just come within, a hair's breadth of making a World Cup, and it feels as though we're being punished, because where do I get my opportunities? Where do I get exposure? The kind of divide you mentioned earlier on between, I guess, the top sort of 11 or 12 teams and the bottom, the next 12, which makes out the 2014 World Cup. This is a ring-fenced competition. There's no promotion relegation until, I think, 2030. So are we actually running the risk of making all of the 12 to 24 teams more competitive with one another, while the top 12 continue to get further away? I would have loved to have seen a promotion relegation system. I think if I was a Georgian fan, I would perhaps be feeling slightly
I
hard
agree.
done
I
by.
think Georgia are the nation who should be a bit salty, because I think that they would probably win this quite comfortably. And I think that Georgia are probably the one from that pool, in my opinion, unless Samoa were able to get it together, because I think Samoa's athletes are more than comparable to Georgia's. But as a team, I think Georgia are the one who are ready, in my opinion, to play against the likes of Wales, Italy, Fiji more often, because I think those would be competitive games. But sorry, I interrupted you there, but
No, no.
that's my similar feeling as well.
Yeah, so I think there are losers of this calendar, as well as winners. But I think that when you look at some of the matchups that are possible, and the World Rugby, I think, is concerned about your point about there being competitive matchups in the Rugby World Cup, and clearly the fact that it's the same 24 teams that are going to be in 2027 is with that in mind. They want these teams to be competitive. They want to get them as much exposure as they can leading into that tournament, and I understand that. And these things are so difficult. I'm not pretending for one moment that it's easy to run World Rugby, but this strikes me as a calendar that suits the established powers. I think it works for the bigger nations, and I think it works for the 2027 World Cup. I wonder how it works for the 2031 World Cup, or indeed the 2035 World Cup. And I think one of the problems with being a sporting administrator is you have to wear lots of different hats. You have to think about the next 12 months, but you also have to think about the next 12 years. And that's only 3 World Cup cycles. Things you do now affect who's going to qualify in 12 years' time. I can't wait to see some of those games. I'm really, really excited. There's lots of ambiguity and uncertainty around where they're going to be. And, one doesn't want to get on their high horse about these things, but I do worry somewhat about World Rugby's commitment to the climate and to
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
lots and lots of long haul flights. Maybe that's inevitable. We don't have a sport like football where you can rely on your near neighbours for high level competition all the time. We do have to travel to play other competitive nations, but certainly when the tier one competition, the fixtures were announced last week, weren't they? And
Mm.
certainly a few people on X were logging up the kilometres flown, and it doesn't look great.
Yeah, I
But
call it the jet lag cup. Like my Wales, for example, have play Fiji in an unknown location. I've seen, and we don't know where Fiji's games are going to be played yet, but not in Fiji, basically. And then they play South Africa. No, they play away to Argentina and then away to South Africa, which is the worst because you go from like the UK time zone to Argentina time zone back to UK time zone again across the three games. That's going to be brutal. But you're right, the air miles, and I completely see what you're saying. And my worry for this is as well is that we're going to all become quite bored of each other quite quickly.
yeah, and how many games are going to be played in neutral venues, especially for the tier two competition to save costs.
Mm,
Like I said, the game I've enjoyed watching most in the last 12 months was Chile against Samoa. And the brilliant thing about that was there were 20,000 Chileans there shouting and screaming. And partly that's the rarity of a big opponent in Chile, the momentum of the sport, but also there's the stakes inherent in if we win this, we're going to the World Cup. And I wonder a little bit about the stakes for this tournament. It's very easy for coaches of national teams to see the merit in playing against teams ranked above and just below them. I wonder if I'm a fan of rugby or I'm developing an affection for rugby in some of those tier two nations, whether I'll understand why we're playing teams on the other side of the world and what's it for and what do we get if we win. But again, I don't want to criticize this too much. I mean, so, a nation like Zimbabwe, a nation like Chile, they're going to get so much more rugby against rival nations of a similar or higher caliber, which is ultimately what every developing country wants. And, it's a very hard job designing a global rugby calendar. And
mm.
I think there are problems with this. I think the one that stings a little bit is the absence of promotion relegation for me. But I understand that if you were, let's say Wales, because obviously at the moment they're towards the bottom of those 12 top nations, who have their own financial problems, as we well know, I can understand that they would be very, very unwilling to sign up to something where if their poor recent form continues for another few months or another year, they could suddenly be in a position where they're losing out on a huge amount of revenue. I mean, we already saw that they were struggling to sell tickets against Argentina, which is a top side. I can't imagine they'd be selling out loads if they were at home to Hong Kong, China, for example. So, I understand it. I really like some of the matchups individually. I do have some reservations, but ultimately, it's our job to get behind it, I suppose.
Now I've just got it in my head that if Wales were to go into the second tier one, then the whole thing could be held in Wales because we've got loads of rugby grounds. So that would just be cool. I love the idea of like
That'd be
going.
great for you.
I've got Nestle, like Parky Scarlets hosting like Brazil versus I don't know, Spain or something. I don't know, but yeah, that
Mm.
kind of thing. So that would be interesting. The I think in terms of going back to talking about benefits to the tier two, it might be a bit of a risk in terms of benefiting some teams a bit more than others because the likes of Hong Kong and Zimbabwe are the sole qualifiers from their kind of annual tournament, which is Rugby Africa and Rugby Asia. So if this achieves what I think World Rugby want out of it, which is that it makes those teams better ahead of they go to play at the Rugby World Cup, then it just means that when they go back to play in their national tournament again, they're going to win it by even more than they did. And so you're creating more inequality there, and it's harder for the likes of UAE to challenge Hong Kong, China. I think Rugby Europe benefits from it a lot because they have so many teams in it, and that will help them get better. I think, and then there's the whole narrative in which you've alluded to earlier, which is that the Pacific Nations Cup sides, that whole tournament almost feels like it's constructed to make sure that none of them fail. That feels like the whole ethos behind that. And kind of, this wasn't in my notes to ask you, but since it's kind of come onto it, as someone who is steeped in South American rugby, the perception of what's of how World Rugby are approaching USA Rugby at the moment. What's your kind of view on that? Because some people are quite salty about it.
Yeah, it's worth pointing out there were a lot of people in South America who were very, very unhappy about the perceived or indeed real, depending on who you ask, prefer treatment that the USA has shown. I think it's no secret that World Rugby wants rugby to work in the US, and they have spent a lot of money and a lot of time, not just recently, but over a very long period of time to try to make that work. And obviously, with both the men's and women's World Cup being hosted there in the next few years, there is, I think, a degree of urgency that is palpable with regard to the investments that are being made. The MLR, of course, is really struggling and kind of is, I don't think it's exaggerating to say it's sort of hanging on, by the skin of its teeth at the moment. They've lost, I think, 4 teams already in the off season. And there is a kind of a comparison there, of course, with this, I guess, the success of Super Rugby Americas, which is expanding while other rugby competitions around the world seem to be contracting. There'll be a 4th Argentinian franchise in the next season in 2026. Some of the stuff, I think, was slightly misreported. I think there was a statement figure of $250 million, I think it was, that was given to the USA Rugby. And this is at a time where lots of other regional budgets are being cut. Now, there was nuance to that. Some of that money would already been committed and some of it meant different things. There is certainly a perception among the kind of rugby decision makers in South America that they don't get the access, the kind of financial, I don't want to say rewards, but there was a sense after the 2023 World Cup where South America had 3 teams for the first time that with the expanded tournament, maybe they would get given an additional automatic spot, which they didn't get. That spot went to Asia. And of course, Hong Kong, China are by most metrics the weakest team in this World Cup. And, I suspect they would have lost to all 4 of the teams in the final qualification tournament. And yet, nevertheless, they will be at that World Cup. And Belgium, Namibia, and Brazil will not be. So, there is certainly a degree of saltiness, as you said. The drive in South America is to try and kind of make themselves sustainable and make themselves impossible to deny. And, it's worth giving a lot of credit to Argentina. I think one thing that Argentina has done really well over recent years, I think you might have even done a video on this, is the number of fixtures played by the Argentina 15. I think Argentina made a strategic decision that it was good for them and also good for the region if you could strengthen their neighbours to the point where you could play more regular test matches against Uruguay and Chile. And the Argentina 15 going out and playing those matches has been a really key part of developing Uruguay and Chile and Brazil and the like. I would like to see other regional leaders take on a similar role. I would love to see South Africa sending more invitational sides to other African countries. I would love to see Japan sending more invitational sides to the other Asian countries to try and lessen the impact of that gap in exposure that you were talking about. But it's hard. It's very hard to do without money. And as we all know, in rugby, that is increasingly hard to come by. And, smart people make these decisions, not idiots. And when they make a decision that you think is wrong, it's almost always because it's harder than you think, not because it's easy and they're just they're acting maliciously. Doesn't mean you have to agree with everything. There's lots of things I don't agree with, but when almost every rugby nation seems to be bleeding money, or at least kind of not swimming in it, you have to ask yourself, well, can the things I want to happen in this current climate?
We've come to the end. We've come to the final point of the show. So that just leaves me to say thank you to Joe for joining me for this really in-depth discussion about Tier 2. I'm really appreciative, mate, because let's be honest, there's not tons of Tier 2 chat out there in the rugby world, particularly English language chat. So I really appreciate you coming on to help me shine some light on these darker corners of the rugby world.
Absolute pleasure. Cheers to you.
Thank you to everybody for watching/listening. If you've enjoyed what you've seen so far, please subscribe to the YouTube channel. I really appreciate it. I'm trying to get to 10,000 subscribers. I'd love if you were one of them. You can also get membership to this channel for just 99 pence a month. That will get you access to exclusive videos that you won't find anywhere else. Enjoy your rugby, and I hope that everybody's team wins. Cheers.